scripture reading will be Luke 14:16 through 24. Luke 14:16 through 24. But he said to them, a man once gave a great banquet and invited many. And at the time for the banquet, he sent his servants to say to those who had been invited, Come, for everything is now ready. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, I've bought a field and must go out and see it. Please have me excused. Another said, I've bought 5 yoke of oxen and I go examine them. Please have me excused. Another said, I've married a wife and therefore I cannot come. So the servant came and reported these things to his master. Then the master of the house became angry and said to his servant, Go out quickly to the streets and lanes of the city and bring in the poor, crippled, blind, and lame. The servant said, Sir, what you commanded has been done, and still there is room. The master said to the servant, Go out to the highways and hedges and compel people to come in, that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those men who were invited shall taste my banquet.
I'm glad to be here. I hope you're glad to be here as well. I apologize to Charlie. I think I made him have a lot of extra work last week. I went a little bit over, and he was trying to figure out how to fit that sermon into a shorter time period, so he just cut out the parts he didn't like. That's my understanding. I'm not sure. He's nodding back there. We're talking still about this dinner that Jesus was at the beginning of the chapter. He's still at the same dinner. The lesson this morning is called The Great Feast, and Jesus is still at the same home with the same group of people he was at the beginning of the chapter. You remember he's invited apparently for the purpose of trying to test him to see whether or not he'll heal this man. These are important people, and in their midst comes this guy with dropsy, and they're waiting to see not just will Jesus heal him, but will he do it on the Sabbath. What I think is they really wanted to see a miracle. They're like Herod was later. They want to see a miracle. They look forward to that, but they're not sure whether he should do it on the Sabbath day. And when he does it on the Sabbath day, that gives them a reason to condemn him. But they were really looking forward to seeing the miracle, I believe, just like we probably would be. I mean, we'd want to see that. And how sad it must be to find yourself in the very presence of God in the flesh and be more concerned about your own traditions and your own religion than you are with being in the presence of God. How sad that must be. How terribly disappointing it must be for him. You know, in John chapter 4, we have the woman at the well, and when she comes into the presence of Jesus, she's right there with Jesus, side by side, face to face, talking with Jesus, and she's more concerned about whether we should worship on this mountain or in Jerusalem. She's more concerned with the traditions of her fathers than she is the presence of the Christ. Throughout our studies in Luke, we've noted the number of times that the Pharisees and the scribes were more concerned about their traditions. They were more concerned about their rules. They were more concerned about their regulations. They were more concerned about doing things right and wrong than they were about the presence of Jesus. And lest we begin to imagine that all of that ended some 2,000 years ago, let's look at today. There are churches today that are more concerned with the number of cups that you use for communion than they are the one that they're communing with. How sad that is. There are churches today, as we look around, I know good Christians who are concerned about whether the bread should be broken before or after it's passed. And even here, I've heard discussions about our communion. You know, the little cups, the ones we had before were really hard to open, right? Everybody agrees with that? I mean, if you got fingernails, maybe it wasn't an issue for you. I know Cindy had to go help somebody and such like. But for those of us that don't have fingernails, they were hard. The newer ones are a whole lot easier to use, aren't they? They really are. I think so. I like that fine. But I've heard people say, well, You know, George, it just seems like we're rushing through communion now with the individual things instead of having people passing it and we've all got it there, and it seems like we're rushing through communion. But when the person that's doing the communion meditation stops and takes a few extra seconds for us to meditate, everybody's looking around. Where's he at? Isn't he supposed to be up there already? What's going on? You know, this didn't all end 2,000 years ago. We still are the same types of people in so many ways that we've always been. I've heard people say, oh, I love these individual communion things. I love this. This just makes it so much easier for me and for my family. And it's so much easier, instead of having the men passing the trays, I can focus more on communion. I've heard others say, I can't wait till we get back to the men passing the trays. I don't like these little individual things. I like that when the men are standing up in front of us passing the... You know what? Once again, are we so focused on the how and the why that we've forgotten the who? That's what Jesus is talking about. That's what Jesus came to address. The Jews had become so focused on the why and the how that they had forgotten the who. And so at the right time, Jesus came to say, hey, wait, stop. Look at the who. And we need to constantly be looking at the who. Why do we do communion? Why do we participate in the Lord's Supper? Because Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me. Not do this by the number of cups. Not do this by whether or not the bread is broken. Not do this by whether we pass it out from side to side or front to back or already have it in our hands when we sit down. But do this in remembrance of Jesus. And that's the focus of the Lord's Supper when we do that. Like those of olden days, we need to be very careful lest we find ourselves more concerned with the how and why than the who. Because the Lord promised us that when we come together in His name, He is here with us when we commune. He is here with us. We're in the very presence of God when we remember His Son. We're in the very presence of Jesus when we're partaking of the bread and of the cup. How important is it? Oh, it's very important. It's all utmost importance. But for them, once the show was over, that's, they saw the miracle and everything. Then the next thing that happened, they started jockeying for position to see who's going to get the best place to sit. And they can't wait for the feast. And last week we saw that even in the presence of God in the flesh, even in the presence of Jesus, they're more concerned with where they can sit when they get ready to eat. I guess maybe they didn't want to sit next to the guy with the dirty teeth. I don't know. Maybe they didn't want to sit across from the lady that chews with her mouth full or speaks with her mouth full. I don't know what the problem was, but they all were looking for the best seats in the house, and Jesus gave them a lesson about that. We talked about that. But, I don't understand that. Through the years, I've heard countless preachers say something along the line with, I'd be satisfied with the smallest little shack in heaven as long as it's on the right side of the river. I don't have to have a mansion. Well, I'm not going to be satisfied with a shack. I'm only going to be satisfied with being in the presence of Jesus. I don't care about the shack. I don't care about where I'm going to live or what I'm going to eat or what else is going on in the world. I'm going to be in the presence of Jesus, and that's all I really care about. And you know what? We're here today. He's here today. We're in the presence of Jesus today. What more could we possibly ask for in the whole world? How great is it that He says He's with us? How great is that? And yet they're busy worried about where they're going to sit. This week we're going to look at another parable Jesus told them at the same sitting there, apparently after they all found their honored positions. And it wasn't so much as a formal teaching as a dinner discussion. Not all teaching, by the way, has to take place in a formal setting. The preacher's not the only one that does teaching. The Bible class teacher's not the only one that does teaching. Moms and dads teach all the time, especially when they have an opportunity around the dinner table. And so do grandparents. And by the way, so do friends. We share and we teach with one another all the time without having to have formal settings. Jesus is speaking here of a feast, but he's not talking about food. He's already made it clear that the physical feasting was secondary to personal feasting. In his life, he'd already shown that when he was tempted by Satan after 40 days in the desert. And Satan says, why don't you turn these rocks, these stones into bread? And Jesus turns around and he said to him, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Jesus said, it's not about the physical need, it's about the spiritual food that we need. In John 4:31 through 34, when the woman is there at the well with Jesus, the disciples come back and they urge him and they say, Rabbi, eat. And he answered them, I have food to eat of which you know nothing. So they argued among themselves or said to one another, has anyone brought him anything to eat? Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me. He understood there's a difference between a physical food, which takes care of our bodies, and a spiritual food which takes care of our souls. And that's what he's talking about with this great feast in this parable. This gospel feast is a feast for the soul. It's a true feast in respect to, first off, the quality of the provisions. It's soul food. It really is soul food that the master is providing here, and the abundance of provision. It's inexhaustible. There's no limit to the number of people that can be in heaven. You know, I think sometimes we worry about things because, well, what if they run out? What if they run? We need to get in line so that they don't run out. If it's something big, if they're giving away something, we all want to get there in time to make sure we can get ours before they run out. But there is no before they run out in heaven. God's not going to run out of provisions. We're all going to be taken care of. We're all going to be loved, and how great that is. How wonderful that is. Can you imagine? Grandparents, I'm talking to now. Grandparents, can you imagine going to your children and saying, don't have any more babies because I don't have love for any more? You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't even imagine that. When that next one's born, you love that next one just as much, and your heart pours out to that one just as much as it did everyone before that. And you think to yourself, I don't know how I could have lived without this one. No, there's no running out of God's love. There's no running out of God's abundance. It's just not going to happen. We need to understand that. But then the fellowship. Oh man, sitting down with our brothers and sisters in the presence of our Master and Savior. Sitting down together with Jesus in our midst. How wonderful that is. The joy that it gives, because feasts are symbols of joy. You know, I can't wait. I really can't, to get back to fellowship meals together. Being able to sit across the table from each other and just share life and share the blessings that God has given us. And yeah, sometimes there's some spiritual discussions. Sometimes it's discussions about grandkids. Sometimes it's discussions about children. Sometimes it's discussions about nothing at all except just being there together. And I miss that. I miss the hugs. I miss all of those things. This COVID thing has messed up so much of that. I miss our visiting and sharing time together in the presence of the Lord. Don't you miss that? And if God calls me and says, hey, I'm throwing a banquet, you're invited, I'm in. I'm going. I'm going to be there. I'm looking forward to that. But then Jesus talks about the guests who were invited. He invited many, it says. He didn't personally go out and invite everybody. He sent his servants out to do the inviting. You know, he still does the same thing today. You know, Paul refers to the foolishness of preaching to save souls. You know, God chose the foolishness of preaching. There's a lot of ways he could have chosen, but that's what God chose. And then Jesus commanded us to go into the world and to teach the gospel to everyone. He didn't personally go to every single person in the history of the world. No, he told us, hey, I want you to go out and teach people. Invite them to the feast. Invite them to the feast. We're the servants that are sent out. And the first ones that were invited were friends and loved ones. You know, we forget that sometimes. You know, sometimes we're more than willing to go into the world if that means let's get on a plane and go to Russia, or let's get on a plane and go to China, or let's get on a plane and go to South America, or let's get on a plane and go somewhere. We're a lot less ambitious, maybe I'll say, for lack of a better word, about let's pick up the phone and call our loved one, or let's go next door and talk to our neighbor. Jesus came first to the friends and loved ones, to the Jews, to the descendants of Abraham, to his family. That's who he came to first. They had the law and the prophets. They should have been prepared for and looking forward to the coming of the Messiah. And they sort of were. He wasn't what they were expecting. But they all, every single one of them, rejected him. They didn't say, we won't come or we won't go, and neither did the ones that were invited to the banquet say, well, I'm not coming. Well, sort of. But they sort of did. The first one says, I've bought a piece of ground and I've got to go see it. I ask you to have me excused. You know, riches can be deceitful. They misplaced their emphasis. Hey, look, I've got the wealth and I really don't need, you know, when we're campaigning, when I've campaigned in the past and others have campaigned, they can tell you, when you're door knocking, a lot of times you like to door knock in the poorer areas of the community rather than the wealthier areas of the community. It seems like the doors open a little easier. It may be because the poor people realize they have a need and the rich people don't have a need. They've got everything they need. It's not saying rich people are any less important in God's eyes. Just saying sometimes it's harder to get in the door. You know, same thing he's talking about there with that. Another says, verse 19, I've bought 5 yoke of oxen. I'm going to test them. I ask you to have me excused. You know, sometimes the cares of the world can be just too great for us to respond. I've got too much to do. You don't understand, I'm busy. I'm just too busy right now. Maybe later I'll be okay. He was more concerned about his oxen and his livelihood than he was the feast. By the way, it doesn't say he was rich. Doesn't imply that he's rich at all. He's just a hard worker. The next one says, I've married a wife and therefore I can't come. Man, I'd like to come, but I'm going on my honeymoon. You know, that's, you know, I'd rather take pleasure in this world than bring my wife with me. You know, there's a lot of people in this world that they're just out to please themselves in whatever they do, and all they care about really is what pleases me today and what I want to do today and what I've got to do today, and I really don't have time for all of this feast stuff. They all basically say, I'm too busy with my own life. So the master invited others in their place. Verse 21, that servant came, reported these things to his master. The master of the house, being angry, said to his servant, go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city, bring in here the poor and the maimed, the lame and the blind. Here are the ones without the advantages that the Jews had known. They hadn't had the law and the prophets. They hadn't had all of the blessings that the Jews had experienced. Here's the publicans, the sinners. Here are the Samaritans and those that are on the outside looking in. They see the Jews. They've seen what the Jews have had, but they haven't experienced it themselves. And here God is opening the banquet to them in this parable so that they're welcome to come in. And the servant says, verse 22, Master, it's done as you commanded, and there's still room, or still there's room. The invitation was accepted by them. They came in, but there was still more room. You know, the Jews rejected the message. These received the message, but there's still room. And where is there room? There's room in God's heart. He desires that all men be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. 1 Timothy 2 and verse 4. There's room in Christ's covenant. The love of Christ compels us because we judge this, that if one died for all, then all have died. That's in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 14. There's room in the Father's house. Remember what Jesus said? Remember what Jesus said? In my Father's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. John 14 and verse 1. There's plenty of room. Room for who? Room for the indigent. For those that have nothing. Room for the indifferent, for those that have no hope. Room for the outcast, for those that have been thrown out by society. There's room for all in the house of God. Those that have been rejected by everybody else are welcomed in. Matthew 8 and verse 11, I say to you that many will come from the east and the west, sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Many will come. Us. We're at Gentiles now. Sort of. Maybe. Does it sound like it? He's inviting everybody to come to the feast. Verse 23, the master said to the servant, go out into the highways and hedges and compel them to come in. that my house may be filled. Up to now, we've had no opportunity, but now the Gentiles are welcome too. The Gentiles can come to God. How great that is. And not just that we can come, but compel them to come. You know, sometimes when we preach with fervor, we preach with vigor. Sometimes when we teach with fervor, we teach with vigor. We're trying to compel people, if we can, be saved from this crooked generation. That's what the Bible teaches. We need to be concerned about those that are lost. We need to be calling our friends. We need to be calling our family. We need to be talking to them about their souls, because their souls are so important. And yet, there's still room. There's still room in the house. The master's still waiting for them to show up. Romans 11:11 says, I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Speaking of the Jews. Certainly not, but through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Wow, how great that is. So what lessons can we learn? What lessons can we learn from this parable as we look at? The first one is that whoever declines the invitation is going to be forever excluded from the feast. Verse 24 of our text, for I say to you that none of those men who were invited shall taste my supper. It's not that you're not going to get to be a part of the supper. You're not even going to get the leftovers. You're not going to get any part of it. You're not even going to taste it. You were invited, you didn't show up, you ain't going to get any part of it. And God is very serious about that. Jesus is teaching in this parable that God is very serious about that. Matthew 8:12, Jesus says, the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness. There'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Who? The sons of the kingdom. He's not talking about the outsiders being cast out. He's talking about the ones that were invited being cast out because they rejected God. It's a tough teaching, but it's a real teaching. It's something we need to understand because there's only one way. I think we forget that sometimes. We look around at the world and we say, well, there's this way and there's that way, and these are good people and those are good people, and maybe this is okay and maybe that's okay, and maybe God will love this and maybe God will love that, and maybe he'll just invite everybody in, and he does invite everybody in. But it says that those who reject him won't come in. Jesus says in John 14 and verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And he follows it up with, no man comes to the Father except through me. There is no other way. There's only one way. It's Jesus, and we need to understand that. Those who reject the Lord are going to be rejected by him. I think we forget that sometimes. Proverbs 1, verses 24 through 33 goes like this. Because I've called and you refused, I've stretched out my hand and no one regarded. Because you disdained my counsel and would have none of my rebuke, I will laugh at your calamity. I'll mock when your terror comes. When your terror comes like a storm and your destruction comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you. Then they'll call on me, but I will not answer. They'll seek me diligently, but they will not find me. Because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord, they would have none of my counsel and despise my every rebuke. Therefore, they shall eat the fruit of their own way and be filled to the full of their own fantasies. For the turning away of the simple will slay them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But whoever listens to me, I like that, will dwell safely and be secure without fear or evil. You know, the stubbornness of man is not going to defeat the Lord's purpose. When God calls everyone and some don't come, that's not going to stop God from still loving those who come. And it's not going to stop God from still having his feast. There's a parallel account found over in Matthew 22. In Matthew 22:10, we see what happens as a result of the servants going out. The servants went out into the highways and gathered together all whom they found, both bad and good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. See, God's work's going to be taken care of. God's will is going to be done. God's banquet hall is going to be filled with those who love him. But there are going to be some who don't want to go. So the question is, where are we? Are we more concerned with hows and whys than we are with the presence of God and being in the presence of God. Far be it from us that we get so tangled up with doing things right or doing things the right way that we forget about who we're doing them for. Not saying to do things the wrong way. I'm saying to remember why and remember who, because it all matters so much. Luke doesn't say it or record it, but in Matthew's account, Jesus records one other person in there that I think we need to mention very quickly and briefly as we get ready to close. In Matthew's account, there's a fellow there that doesn't have on a wedding garment. If you read that in Matthew 22, you'll see that account, and he says the man didn't have a wedding garment, and the master of the feast, the host of the feast, threw him out. They threw him out because he didn't have a wedding garment. And we look at that sometimes and we say how hard that is and how tough that teaching is and things like that. But you know, there's a lesson there for us. There are many people who are willing to partake of the blessings of being a Christian who are not committed to following through with living as a Christian. That's the lesson that we learn from that fellow being thrown out. He wasn't willing to pay the price. Oh, he was willing to come. Yeah, as long as there's a big feast, yeah, count me in. Yeah, I'll take all the salvation in the world you want to give me. I'll take forgiveness. I'll take all these other things, but don't ask me to actually be committed. No, I'm not gonna go so far as to get a wedding garment so that I'm appropriately attired. Like the Jews before, more than willing to accept the word or name of being children of God, being saved, but not willing to do whatever it took to follow God. So how about you? Have you been to Jesus for that cleansing power? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in His grace this hour? Again, are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Have you confessed your faith in Jesus as the Son of God? Have you recognized Him as the Lord of your life? Have you repented of your old way of life and said, hey, you know what? I'm going to turn around. I'm going to start living for God. I may not be perfect, but I'm going to be better than I was. I may not be perfect, but I'm going to keep trying, and every day I'm going to make myself be more the way He would want me to be. That's what repentance is really all about. Have you been baptized so that your sins could be washed away and you could be added to the church of the Lord? And having done all those things, are you faithfully attending the feast? Are you faithfully spending the time in fellowship with the God of glory? If you need to respond this morning, we're going to give you the opportunity to do that. We'll sing a song to encourage you if you'd like to come while we stand and as we sing.